Welcome to the 23rd Ship of the Week. Most of the ships ever built carried out rather ordinary lives. This is not at all the case with today's vessel, the first yacht built in the United States, Cleopatra's Barge. For millennia, ships served one of two purposes, commercial or military, a distinction that was even less clear since most merchant ships also carried plenty of guns. European high society's consolidation of wealth and power had occasionally, over the centuries, allowed particularly influential individuals, usually royals, to commission ships solely for their own pleasure. But by the turn of the 19th century, the practice had yet to take root among the elite of the new republic in the United States. That changed when George Crowninshield, Jr., a member of the powerful Boston family, ordered a yacht from the Salem, Massachusetts shipbuilding firm under Retire Beckett. The ship was about 100 feet in length and likely displaced a little under 300 tons. Originally under the name Car of Concordia, upon completion she was given the name Cleopatra's Barge, for the ship that serves as a setting for Mark Antony and the Ptolemaic Egyptian queen in William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. The ship was finally appointed to serve her leisure role, although the precise arrangement of her accommodations is unclear. While the vessel's silhouette rose in the Salem dockyards and preparations for her launch neared completion, thousands of curious townsfolk stopped by to visit the first American private yacht. Indeed, the nature of Mr. Crownenshield's appetite for pomp and circumstance turned the launch into the local event, and the ship was opened for tours a few months after entering the water for the first time in October of 1816. From Salem, Cleopatra's Barge prepared to establish another record and become the first American yacht to cross the Atlantic, under the capable command of George Crownenshield's cousin and naval veteran of the War for Independence and War of 1812, Benjamin Crownenshield. The Crowninshield family's position in Boston society made them fairly well connected, helped considerably by the fact that George Crownenshield's brother, also confusingly named Benjamin, was U.S. Secretary of the Navy at the time. The ship therefore carried on their trip to Europe greetings from then U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain John Quincy Adams, then U.S. Secretary of State James Monroe, and several hundred other significant figures. The ship's relatively small size facilitated her handling by a relatively small crew, and 14 men were carried aboard, including an African-American cook by the name of William Chapman, with the unusual and yet unverified backstory that he sailed with Captain James Cook to what is now the U.S. state of Hawaii and lived on the islands for a time before returning to the United States. Cleopatra's Barge, upon successfully crossing the Atlantic, ventured into the Mediterranean to wander from port to port, never failing to cause a ruckus. American maritime historian Paul Johnston describes the chaos of her visit to Barcelona, where she was practically stampeded by ecstatic crowds, some of whom missed the gangway entirely and toppled into the harbor. At least one individual brandished a sidearm to gain access to the ship, and to quote Johnston, "A pregnant woman was so overcome by the experience that she went into labor." End quote. At Genoa, the crew met the distinguished Hungarian astronomer Franz Xaver von Zach, who evidently spent quite a significant period discussing lunar positioning calculations with Cleopatra's cook, Mr. Chapman, who I suppose may have acquired knowledge of the subject during his time aboard ship with Captain Cook. Now, Napoleon. The exiled French emperor had by then spent the last several years on the South Atlantic island of St. Helena, following his crusade across Europe that ended rather poorly for him. It was no secret that Mr. Crownenshield, the owner, not the captain or the secretary, who I think was also aboard, greatly admired Bonaparte, and perhaps wished to aid him in some way. Even before Cleopatra's Barge arrived in Rome, metaphorical alarm bells were going off in various capitals. But upon arriving in the Eternal City, suspicions soared, once Crowninshield met with Napoleon's mother, Letitia Romolino, and siblings Lucien and Pauline. The yacht spent much of the rest of her time in the Mediterranean, with British, French, and United States naval vessels shadowing her movements, just in case anybody got any ideas. No dash to St. Helena was attempted, likely to the relief of the navies, since the yacht's great speed meant catching her would be quite a feat anyway. It does appear, however, that Crown and Shield did receive a pair of the Emperor's boots as an unusual keepsake. The ship was barely tied up back in Salem when Crown and Shield began preparing an itinerary for his next outing, but he would never again get the opportunity to go to sea. George Crowninshield died aboard his ship on the 26th of November, 1817. The yacht and much of her fittings went up for sale, and after a brief period as a coastal trader under the ownership of yet another Crowninshield, she was purchased by William Sturgis of the Boston firm Bryant and Sturgis in early 1820, and the ship was readied for a long voyage. Placed under the command of John Suter, Sturgis gave the captain orders to sell the ship upon arrival at what was then frequently known in the West as the Sandwich Islands, preferably for a large sum of valuable sandalwood. She arrived later that year, and was immediately upon arrival boarded by King Kamehameha II of Hawaii, who just as immediately decided to take Suter up on his offer to sell the ship. 10 days later, on the 16th of November, the deal was closed at roughly £1 million of sandalwood, although the captain did not present the king with a formal contract, an action that was likely much to the chagrin of Bryant and Sturgis. Repainted, refitted, and flying the royal standard of the Kingdom of Hawaii, Cleopatra's Barge became the king's royal yacht. Frequently used to curry favor with the local missionaries, the king, a ship buff himself, loudly, and apparently often drunkenly, sailed back and forth between Lahaina and Honolulu, gun salutes and all. Following a nearly year-long refit to repair her decaying timbers, the ship returned to service bearing a new name, Ha'aheo o Hawaii, completing her transition to her second life as the early 19th century Hawaiian equivalent of Air Force One. The king sailed for Britain on a state visit in late 1823 on another ship, and so Ha'aheo was still in Hawaii the following April when, apparently in part due to the intoxication of her crew and in part due to the deterioration of the weather, the royal yacht was driven onto a reef in Hanalei Bay, seen here from low Earth orbit in a photo taken by a crew member aboard the International Space Station, I suppose I should note a considerable time after Ha'aheo was wrecked. Attempts by the locals to refloat the ship, bearing little fruit, the stricken yacht was stripped of her fittings and abandoned, the sea breaking her up where she lay. The king never got the chance to meet King George IV. He died of measles at just 26 years old in England, along with several other members of his delegation. The seismically and meteorologically turbulent environment of the Hawaiian Islands was not kind to the shipwreck, but 170 years after the yacht was lost, the aforementioned Paul Johnston of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., received approval from both the institution and the state of Hawaii, and set out to locate whatever remained of the once proud ship. Between 1996 and 2000, well over 1,000 artifacts from the wreck were recovered from the reef, from hull spikes to timber fragments to other metal fittings. And at the Peabody Essex Museum, at the birthplace of Cleopatra's Barge in Salem, Massachusetts, a reconstruction of the yacht's original salon, complete with many fittings removed from the ship before her sale to the Hawaiian king, is available for viewing. While the story of the ship herself has ended, there are still plenty of stories to tell.